state-by-state method. In the case of, let's say you were saying about the wind turbines, the problem there is rare earth materials. We have to export that to China to get it processed. They need magnets, and these magnets require rare earth materials. The Chinese know how to build them. We don't have a facility to process that metal.
And they're buying those resources all over the world, right. Africa and other nations where the few deposits exist, and they're trying to put a lock on that raw material, from what I understand.
And again, what I mean by policy, now the Chinese are looking at sustainable energy, building, to be able to build companies that are able to export these kind of products, whether it be wind turbines, clean coal technologies, or even solar panels. That, in order to get that accomplished, and the Chinese have been figuring it out, is to coordinate the raw materials, be able to do on a local basis, be able to offer the infrastructure, the offices, the communication spaces, having the workers reasonably priced, and having all of this, it takes one singular purpose in order to do that. Here in this country, what I've seen so far, there's no nationwide policy. There's a lot of dicta, namely, to use a legal terminology, of rhetoric saying that's how we're going to do it. But you need to coordinate on the state method. You have to go down to citywide. We don't do that.
Yeah. Well, I understand you were just at a conference yourself this morning where you heard someone from one of the local politicians, and you felt like it was, again, all the right words are there, but when it comes to practical matter, the real down-to-earth procedures and practices may not yet be in place. Before you answer that, add one other part to that, and that is I see a lot of the decision-making is left on the private sector corporate level here, because that's always been championed as, what America is about. But it's hard when most of those corporate decisions are short-term in nature versus state-run enterprises in a country like China that's thinking for the 20-year plan, perhaps, and thinking about what sacrifices they need to make today in order to develop their progress in an energy sector, for example. Do you see both playing, our short-term corporate needs as well as our local politics not filling the gap as far as the national policy is concerned?
Yes, I had an opportunity when I was in China to talk to one of the major Chinese construction companies, CITIC, and he said, we're only allowed to export certain services, major construction, and it has to be infrastructure, make investments in mines. The government dictated that policy to that company. We don't do that in this country. We don't dictate private companies what to do. We try to create incentives. The only incentive I heard this morning from this politician was to give a $10,000 tax deduction for the employees. How does that fit with building sustainable companies in this country? It's not guiding them one way.
Yeah, it's not targeted enough.
It's just targeted to hiring people, but it's hard to hire if you don't have a product to sell. Yeah. And when you see Applied Materials discharging 10% of the workforce, that 10% that tax incentive just doesn't work, because they have to manufacture for profit. If they're not manufacturing for profit here, they'll move the operation somewhere else.
Because you are an attorney and because you've been so intricately involved in the contracting process, let me ask this one other part of this puzzle, and that is the legal protections. Can you offer any advice on what politicians should be thinking about in terms of saying, look, we need better legal protections for the intellectual property, for the technology transfer, to protect American firms?
Well, for whatever might be said about intellectual property, and I think that the article I read about Applied Materials is a case in point. It's very hard to protect within China. We have tax treaties for IP protection. The Chinese claim they have protection by the province, but there's no bite. And what I mean by that, there's no way of enforcing, especially I spoke to the Department of Justice, whatever infraction there is. So the only way you can really protect it is how you dispense your construction or your fabrication of your product, and sort of guiding that one way or the other. Another problem is corporate governance, and we have problems with that, and since our society is really not export oriented, we're very, how would I say, wet behind the ears in order to how do we build these corporate relationships, whether it be in China or any part of the world, in such a way to protect our investment in that country.
I want to see new aggressive secretaries take over. I can remember the days of Mickey Cantor, and I'll bet you remember his name when he headed up Department of Commerce and USTR here in the 90s. He was a vicious bulldog when it came to negotiating with the Japanese about opening up their market, especially to our car manufacturers. You mentioned no protections. I know that our FDA, when it comes to Food Drug Administration, when it comes to consumer protections here, you're right. These companies in China just seem to disappear. When they went to investigate them or to penalize them for selling some very faulty goods here that could have and did harm Americans, the entities just disappear in China into the landscape, the partners to reemerge, forming other companies somewhere. So these countries need to insist, and I'm talking about ours, if China is going to continue to trade with us, we need to insist on some of those protections being put in place and enforcement from their end. And if they don't deliver, I say that the only alternative, the only way to remedy that situation is to get tougher on all the trade laws.
Yes, and that's the only way you can deal with that. I mean, we've been battling with China regarding their currency. In reality, we should be really trying to find an equal footing on trade. Right. What our issue is, we should be exporting more. We're failing to do that because we do not have a national cohesive policy in how to export products, whether in a functional way and whether to be able to coordinate between state and federal policy. How do we encourage these companies to build for exporting?
Well, all I can say is, Juan Ramon, I know your talents are very much appreciated in terms of capital development and venture capital in the real world, but I think we need to nominate you to take a position in the USTR or the Department of Commerce. We need somebody like you who really has a practical, pragmatic experience of business on the ground to know how to deal with what are real, let's face it, disadvantages as far as the American business person trying to deal with and trying to find a market in a country like China.
Well, it's sort of discouraging because at one point we were exporting very well. We had our own oil supply. Now we're importing the oil. Our whole auto industry is falling apart. And I was looking at a Japanese news about a company in China. It started fabricating lithium batteries. It went up the feeding frenzy to build cars. And now they have 140,000 employees building one of the more efficient electric cars in China.
Sure. They'll end up taking that market from us as well, as Boeing and others have found, sharing the technology with them a little bit at a time. And the next thing you know, they're not only fulfilling their own domestic market, but they're competing on a worldwide market with our companies.
And this, we're talking about individuals, company entrepreneurs in China. I mean, I noticed that even small shops were building electric cars. There is
and battery technology,
and they were selling to Europe on battery-operated cars. And I was really surprised. There is a great deal of entrepreneurial activity in China, but with one idea set: to export.
Boy, that's exactly the kind of policy we need to see driving some of our politicians and policy here in the United States. So really, thanks. Yours is really not only most engaging, but I think a unique point of view in a world in which we hear a lot of speeches and a lot of rhetoric, but not much down on the ground action when it comes to really turning our companies into export-driven companies so we can compete with nations like China. So Juan Ramon Zarco, thanks very much for sharing your information with us and your views. And we're going to, of course, during the course of this interview, share a way that our viewers can get a hold of you as well.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you for having me.